If you're faced with Andrew Tate, online, the toxic masculinity, what is your actual response to that?
Well, it probably quite a masculine one. I'd probably like to punch him.
At home, we are watching Adolescence with our children. I've got a 16-year-old boy and a 14-year-old girl, and it's a very, very good documentary to watch, or drama.
Adolescence is a British crime drama centering around the story of a 13-year-old schoolboy who's arrested on suspicion of the murder of a female classmate. Critics have described it as flawless, an emotional powerhouse, and a drama so quietly devastating that if you're a parent to a school-age boy, it will chill your blood. In the words of its creators, Adolescence is not a whodunit. Their focus is on the why. And while they don't offer any easy, definitive, or even necessarily comfortable answers, they do point the finger in a very particular direction. One of the adult characters defines this as that
Andrew Tate shite.
But more accurately, it points towards incel culture and the sort of online content that has manifested it into existence.
This young boy feels as though he's been treated as an incel. Google it if you don't know. Incel, because the older girl mocks him for his sexual inexperience and his sexual unattractiveness. And he therefore feels completely, inadequate, and leads to all sorts of horrors, right? Whether that would ever happen in real life, I'm just saying. But the thing that I would say is, do you really want that to be on the curriculum?
Adolescence has ignited conversations about male rage, online radicalisation, and the causes of violence against women and girls. And within days of release, the UK Prime Minister publicly supported a campaign for it to be shown in schools. But it has also been accused of lacking credibility in its depiction of key themes, of conflation characteristic of commentary on the manosphere, and even the demonisation of white working class boys. Meanwhile, false claims that it was based on the notorious Southport stabbings led to one spokesperson for the women's sphere to dismiss criticism about the accuracy of the central protagonist's portrayal as essentially derailing a discussion about violence against women by arguing that the killer should have been wearing different coloured socks. So, how realistic is the worldview presented in Adolescence really? And does it really matter? Especially in the context that it has clearly achieved its author's stated objective of provoking conversations between parents about how to best protect their children from online harms.
The great advantage of the one-shot is that it encourages you as a writer to be incomplete. It encourages a partial telling of a story. So all you get is sort of 4 blinks of an eye, and that encourages, I think, an audience to sit forward and ask its own questions and do its own investigation and think about it and talk about it in a way that is new to them. And that's what we wanted beyond anything else.
Well, to begin with, it is important to emphasise that Adolescence clearly is not a documentary, nor does it claim to be a docudrama, as in a dramatisation based on specific real-life events. Nevertheless, co-creator Stephen Graham has confirmed that it was very much inspired by recent real-life tragedies. Based on the dates and locations he mentions, numerous sources indicate that these are most likely to have been the widely reported murders of 15-year-old Ilian Andam and 12-year-old Ava White. In each case, I have examined the judge's sentencing remarks in an attempt to identify similarities and differences between Jamie Miller and the type of real-life perpetrators of violence that informed his creation, and his portrayal as a 13-year-old boy from a seemingly stable family background, with both father and mother at home, a boy with no previous history of violence, no diagnosed mental health issues, no apparent special education needs, and no evidence of behavioural issues prior to a fatal incident where he stabbed an unarmed girl 7 times in her chest, neck, arm and thigh. His motive for killing appears to be a combination of possible online radicalisation, feelings of inadequacy, rejection and online bullying, after his peers label him as an incel. And in terms of background, Jamie lives in the north of England and is white. I mentioned this aspect of his background because Adolescence has received some criticism for portraying both perpetrator and victim as white. In part because black adolescents are perceived to be disproportionately associated with UK knife crime, but also because in one of the main real-life incidents cited, both victim and perpetrator were black. In this case, the most significant similarity with Jamie's depiction is motive, with both appearing to involve a personal dispute involving aspects of bullying and rejection. Court proceedings revealed that 17-year-old Hassan Sentamu's actions were driven by white-hot anger at being disrespected in public, particularly by girls, with the prosecution highlighting that the day before the murder, his victim and her friends had thrown water on him and teased him about his looks and special education needs. Notably, unlike Jamie Miller, he had a documented history of violent and aggressive behaviour, including threatening others with knives. There was also evidence of mental health issues, no father at home, and he spent time in foster care after complaints about his mother's neglect. He also attended a school for students with special education needs after he was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, which the judge did not accept played a significant factor in his actions. The murder of 12-year-old Ava White occurred roughly 2 years earlier. Notable similarities include age, location, and a dispute involving social media. The identity of the 14-year-old perpetrator has not been made public, but reports indicate that he had a history of behavioural issues, had been involved in previous incidents of violence, and was known to carry a knife. He had also experienced instability in his family life, including issues such as lack of proper adult supervision and support. There was no father at home, and his mother struggled with substance abuse. It may also be relevant to note that in the sentencing remarks, the judge noted that Ava was dressed in similar clothing and taller than boy A, who claims that he thought he was being confronted by another male. Stephen Graham has also directly referenced the murder of 16-year-old Brianna J. in 2023. Similarities in this tragedy appear to include indications of online radicalisation, and the fact that both of the then 15-year-old perpetrators were reported to have been doing well in school and from seemingly stable family backgrounds. This disconnect raised questions about how well their families were aware of their online activities, a theme that Adolescence explores. That being said, subsequent to sentencing, the perception of Eddie Ratcliffe's home environment was severely undermined by revelations that his father was a convicted sex offender with a number of convictions. The court concluded that the murder was primarily motivated by sadistic tendencies, with Eddie Ratcliffe also being found to have been motivated by hatred of transgender people. His co-conspirator Scarlett Jenkinson displayed a fascination with serial killers and videos of torture and murder on the dark web. She also had previous contact with the police over a spiking incident that had led to her school exclusion. So in summary, all three cases involve some similarities to the circumstances portrayed in Adolescence, but also feature significant differences. Most notably, in all cases, there were at least some warning signs relating to previous violent behaviour, with home life stability, mental well-being, behavioural issues, and special education needs also much more apparent. And in all cases, there is no evidence linking the perpetrator to incel subculture, or more generally, the so-called manosphere. Indeed, I have been unable to identify any knife crime homicides where incel culture or manosphere influencers have been found to be a significant or even tangentially relevant factor or motive.
We're not saying either that Jamie is a product of the manosphere. We're not saying that Jamie is the example of incel culture. You know, what we're saying is that a huge number of factors, you know, parents that didn't see him, a school that couldn't help him, friends that couldn't reach him, his own brain chemistry, and then what he was able to access online led to this act.
Mercifully, teenage or even younger female victims of knife crime homicide in England are relatively rare, which may be why they especially stood out to Stephen Graham. I have only been able to identify 8 other cases occurring over the past 10 years. In 2, the killer was in their 20s, and in another, the perpetrator was a 15-year-old female. For context, over the same period, estimates indicate between 300 to 350 boys have been victims of fatal stabbings. Lead writer Jack Thorne has pushed back at criticism about Jamie's portrayal by insisting that his research wasn't tied to any specific real-life tragedies. He's also talked about how he drew significant inspiration from the 1998 book Cries Unheard, Why Children Kill, about a notorious 1960s child killer that also inspired his 2004 play Fanny and Faggot. This examines the story of 11-year-old Mary Bell, who in 1968 was convicted of killing 2 male infants. Both died of strangulation, and in one case the victim's genitals were mutilated and a crude attempt had been made to carve the initial M into his stomach. Gita Sereni's 1998 book sparked some controversy at the time, in part because of its empathetic tone, prioritising the perpetrator's story over her victims, whose voices are largely absent in the text, a criticism that Thorne has also encountered. But Sereni also received significant praise for her insights, an exploration of a deeply complex subject, by meticulously detailing a harrowing childhood that helped to reframe the murders not as the acts of a monster, but as the tragic outcome of a shattered psyche. Adolescence invites a similar perspective, and it is significant to note that Thorne describes television as an empathy box that he views as a powerful platform for advocacy, capable of fostering understanding and connection among viewers by bringing particular perspectives into their homes. Such a quest for empathy presumably informed the decision to portray his fictional child killer as a seemingly cherubic 13-year-old boy, despite research indicating that self-identifying incels are predominantly much older and perceived as unattractive by their peers. The gender swap in Mary Bell's case is certainly past remarkable, especially in the context of the degree of empathy afforded towards a real-life killer. But when compared to Jamie's portrayal, Mary's story may be better considered as one of the 2 specific outliers that helped to prove the rule, in terms of similarity to social signifiers that consistently stand out in most cases considered, including poverty, neglect, abuse, an absent father, violent mother, school exclusion, a diagnosed disorder, and a history of violent behaviour. Mary's crimes occurred in a time before satanic panics, video nasties, computer games, acid house parties, drill music, Tinky Winky, and Andrew Tate trending on TikTok. Nevertheless, presumably Jack Thorne understands that her story shares age-old signifiers for youth crime with more contemporary cases, so you may wonder how or why he came to attribute male violence to ideological exposure in a manner so detached from real-world data.
There is no part of this that's based on a true story. Not one single part.
Well, both authors have discussed their creative process in some detail, so it is possible to draw at least some conclusions. From the outset, Stephen Graham was insistent that they should avoid tropes that pointed fingers towards the parents, and given his lead paternal role, presumably this rule extended to the impact of their absence. Studies indicate that up to 70% of English young offenders come from lone parent families, which may be one reason why the co-creators report initially struggling to pinpoint a motive for their child killer. Links to gang membership and drill music may have been considered. However, both trends are relatively unique to London, where there is a significant racial correlation. And when dismissing accusations of race swapping, Thorne clarified that we're not making a point about race with this. We're making a point about masculinity. We're saying this is about boys. Research consistently highlights that self-protection is by far the most common motivation that boys give for carrying knives in public, and there is also a strong correlation with areas of socioeconomic deprivation. Such themes have parallels with Ashley Walters' personal history, so perhaps his involvement discouraged this direction. Noticeably, publicity around the series has avoided drawing parallels with historical concerns about his own suitability as a role model for young boys, despite an opportunity to point young viewers towards a story about male youth crime that offers the possibility of redemption. Concerns about the impact of children's easy access to pornography may have been another option. But then again, given the tramlines the authors had set for themselves from the outset, it is perhaps inevitable that they would come to lean so heavily into current, well-publicised anxieties about online misogyny and violence against women and girls.
Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, is saying that there are gaps in the system to tackle hateful and harmful activity, both online and offline. Now, she's been saying for some time that the government hasn't updated its counter-extremism strategy. We're told it will span the full spectrum of extremist behaviour, from the far right to Islamist extremism, and also emerging threats like extreme online misogyny and incel culture, which the government is also very concerned about.
Neither writer was familiar with the notion of a manosphere before taking on the project, and the breakthrough finally came when a female collaborator suggested that Thorne look at incels. There are certainly some limited and emerging links between incel ideology and real-life violence, but their significance to specific incidents can often be conflated or inflated, while other potential drivers are played down. Unlike associations with drill music or gang membership, they may be evidence of a symptom more so than a cause. To date, the most commonly referenced UK incident is the 2021 Plymouth shootings, where a 22-year-old white male perpetrator killed 5 people before turning the gun on himself. The inquest into the deaths heard evidence that he had a fascination with serial killers and incel culture. However, the lead investigating police officer told the inquest that his internet history was unremarkable and that there was no evidence linking material found on his computer to the killings. Meanwhile, anyone even remotely familiar with Andrew Tate will understand that he is essentially the polar opposite to an incel. But for the sake of completeness, I should also note that days before the release of Adolescence, various news sources reported that the 26-year-old crossbow killer Kyle Clifford, who murdered 3 adult-aged women in July 2024, had viewed some of Andrew Tate's content. And that, despite the salacious headlines, most sources also reported that the judge made the decision to deny the prosecution's attempts to include this as evidence in the trial on the basis that it had limited relevance and was also potentially prejudicial. Significantly to date, the limited peer-reviewed research into incels indicates that the threat of violence to others is largely exaggerated, and that self-identifying incels are far more likely to be a danger to themselves. Research commissioned by the UK Commission for Countering Extremism found that, in line with previous research, incels typically display extremely poor mental health and extremely high incidences of depression and suicidal thoughts. Relevant socio and demographic trends include that roughly 1 in 2 reported high degrees of loneliness, 1 in 3 had no friends, 1 in 5 were currently not in employment, education or training, and disproportionate levels of disability and neurodiversity are also identified within samples, with 1 in 3 incels estimated as having autistic spectrum disorder. Interestingly, Adolescence's lead writer Jack Thorne has discussed being diagnosed as autistic and is a passionate advocate for better on-screen representation for people with disabilities, describing disability as the forgotten diversity. He has also called for industry quotas to promote visibility. So in this context, Adolescence could be seen as a missed opportunity. But then again, he has also warned against disabled people being pigeonholed into stereotypical roles as villains, victims, and the undateable cripple who can't be loved. He may also have wanted to avoid a potential perception of presenting mental illness or autism as the latest in a long line of what criminologists define as folk devils. Especially given that despite sometimes sensational reporting, the reality is that UK homicides involving individuals with severe mental illness account for a small fraction of total violent crimes, and numerous studies show that rates of criminality are lower among people with autism than without. All in all, one can see why Thorne may have avoided addressing the overrepresentation of disabled people within a population of incels that researchers describe as one of the few groups you can say whatever you want about them, and however hateful, most people will applaud.
You don't know what it's like being unloved. Everyone loves you. You haven't been cast aside over and over and wah. Oh God, the incel tears fuel my soul.
Ultimately, Adolescence's finger-pointing is vague enough that anyone's definitive conclusions as to why Jamie Miller killed Katie Leonard will be informed by their own personal algorithms, prejudices and opinions, be they extreme or otherwise. Its distortion of data and heightened anxieties about the dark side of technology mean that it could very easily have been presented as an episode of Netflix's speculative fiction series, Black Mirror.
I hope what we're not saying is, your kid's next. I hope what we're not saying is, there's Jamies all over the country, because of course there aren't.
But instead, its immersive one-take filming style and relatable normalcy, coupled with compelling performances from its central cast, has managed to convince at least one former head of the Crown Prosecution Services that Adolescence is not depicting an unusual set of circumstances. And, rather troublingly, it is in fact depicting circumstances so commonplace within UK households that one could go as far as to describe them as banal.
This is not something that's depicting an unusual set of circumstances. It's commonplace, it's banal even.
But they called a summit.
Yeah.
I mean, they called a summit. We then discovered there's a charity called Tender,
Yeah.
who have actually had government money to advise on, crisis of young men and masculinity, the usual, and radicalisation and all that.
Yeah.
And that they were advising on the drama. They then get called to the summit with the NSPCC and other children's charities. And there's an emergency summit, and they're going to roll it out around the schools. And instead of accepting that it's fictional, a made-up story, they were treating it as though, in fact, it was the epitome of what's actually happening to young people.
And what can we do as a society to stop and prevent young boys being dragged into this whirlpool of hatred and misogyny? Because obviously that's a very strong feature of the documentary, the drama.
I don't doubt that Adolescence's creators approached their project with entirely positive intentions, and they are to be commended for provoking conversations about how to best protect children in an era when studies indicate that they are increasingly more likely to have access to a smartphone than have a father living in their home. If it takes an element of empathy towards a fictional child killer to permit open, honest and non-judgmental conversations with boys about how they really feel about the world they live in, then perhaps specifics such as Jamie's sock style won't matter. But Adolescence's insertion into school curriculums also clearly risks reinforcing the very sense of alienation its story warns against. Given the added context that it evolved from two men's enhanced empathy towards female victims and perpetrators, the shallowness of regard towards the masculine archetype presented as the focus of their fiction is disappointing to say the least. And researchers adjacent to the loosely defined constellation of online spaces dismissed as a misogynistic pipeline may very well add their example to an increasingly long list of illustrations of gamma bias and an empathy gap encountered by many school-age boys.
Can't you see it too? There is an elephant in the room.